When someone steps onto the political stage with sharp words and pointed accusations, the intent is often clear: undermine, discredit, and dominate the narrative. In this particular moment, the spotlight turned toward a familiar voice in Congress, known for her charisma, media savvy, and unapologetic style. She chose to aim her rhetoric not at policies, not at procedures, but at personal qualifications, specifically education. It wasn't the first time someone tried to reduce another's credibility by questioning their academic pedigree, but it carried a certain smugness, the kind that says, "You couldn't possibly be on my level." She spoke with confidence, weaving, a tone that suggested superiority and mock concern. Her remarks seemed calibrated to both demean and entertain. In her typical fashion, she blended sarcasm with certainty, presenting a caricature of her target's educational background that many in the audience were eager to believe. The underlying message was simple: you're not educated enough to be taken seriously. It was meant to sting. It was meant to stick. She was counting on perception to outpace truth. This is a tactic often used in modern political theater. When facts don't carry enough shock value, personal jabs can fill the void. And in the age of viral clips and sound bites, the more biting the remark, the faster it spreads. Her criticism wasn't about policy depth, historical knowledge, or legislative acumen. It was about status, degrees, and implied inferiority. The goal wasn't to start a debate, it was to end one before it began. What she didn't account for, however, was that academic pedigree doesn't always wear a flashy label. Not everyone waves their credentials like a banner. Some understand that true intellect often walks quietly until provoked. And in this instance, the provocation was loud enough to demand a response. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't just a comment about schooling. It was a deeper swipe at identity, at perceived legitimacy, at the idea of who deserves to hold power and influence. There's an arrogance that can seep into discourse when someone believes their education grants them automatic moral and intellectual authority. It blinds them to the diversity of intellect, how wisdom doesn't always come from elite institutions, but often from experience, grit, and the ability to listen more than speak. The moment this comment was made, it exposed something larger. A presumption that intellect is exclusive to a particular class, a particular mold. It betrayed a mindset that says if you don't check certain boxes, you're unworthy of standing on the same stage. But reality rarely fits within those narrow margins. Intelligence is not a monolith. The ability to lead, persuade, and reason doesn't depend solely on academic credentials. It depends on how ideas are communicated, how decisions are made, how people are understood. To reduce someone's capabilities to the name on their diploma is not just shallow, it's dangerous in a democracy that prides itself on accessibility and representation. What made the situation more revealing was the setting itself. The audience wasn't made up of academics evaluating a thesis. It was everyday Americans watching the political dynamic unfold in real time. And while the words were meant to elicit laughs and nods, they instead left many uneasy. Not because of who was being criticized, but because of what the criticism implied about everyone else who didn't fit the speaker's narrow definition of educated. This wasn't just a jab. It was a moment that reminded people how elitism can rear its head in unexpected ways. When education is used not to uplift, but to belittle, it loses its value. It turns from a tool of empowerment into a weapon of exclusion. And in trying to paint herself as the smarter voice in the room, she ended up revealing her own blind spot. Because it's one thing to tout your own knowledge, it's another to mock someone else's in a way that disregards the complexity of where true understanding comes from. The irony is that in trying to discredit another, she inadvertently discredited herself. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Because audiences, even those who agree with her views, can sense when confidence turns into condescension. The message may have started strong, but the tone betrayed it. And that tone, calculated, dismissive, and a touch too pleased with itself, didn't land the way she expected. When met with a public jab, particularly one that targets something as personal and foundational as education, most would react emotionally. The typical response might be defensive, indignant, or even retaliatory, but not in this case. There was no fire, no raised voice, No attempt to match mockery with mockery. Instead, what followed was a masterclass in composure, calm, deliberate, and absolutely unshakable. Rather than taking the bait and responding with outrage, the individual in question chose a different route, one that leaned into restraint rather than reaction. It's a rare sight in today's political environment, where performative outrage often takes center stage. What made this moment so impactful wasn't just the content of the response, but the manner in which it was delivered. It came slowly, with a sense of patience and precision. Each word felt carefully chosen, not to humiliate but to correct, gracefully yet unmistakably. He didn't deny the insinuation. He didn't argue for sympathy. He simply laid out the facts, his background, his academic journey, his credentials, all presented without an ounce of arrogance. There was no need to embellish or dramatize. The strength of the response lay in its quiet certainty. It wasn't a rebuttal designed to one-up or embarrass. It was a firm reminder that education isn't defined by volume or attitude, but by substance and character. And as he spoke, the tone in the room began to shift. It was subtle at first, the way the energy recalibrated. The audience, once drawn in by the earlier mockery, now found themselves pausing, listening, leaning in. What had started as an attempt to undermine was slowly turning into something entirely different, a moment of unexpected reflection. It became clear that the person being mocked was not only educated, but deeply so. Not just in terms of degrees, but in his understanding of people, institutions, and public service. That's the brilliance of a composed response. It forces the room to reconsider everything that came before it. The earlier insults, once so sharp and sure, now hung in the air with a kind of awkwardness, stripped of their power. Because when someone responds to derision not with anger but with elegance, they reveal the weakness of the original attack. Mockery thrives on chaos, but it wilts under calm. And here's what makes the moment even more striking. He didn't insult back. He didn't return the personal jab with one of his own. Instead, he shifted the entire tone of the exchange, turning it from a spectacle into a quiet reckoning. That approach doesn't just win points in a debate, it resonates on a deeper level. It demonstrates control, self-awareness, and the kind of humility that often disarms critics far more effectively than retaliation ever could. The real weight of his words came not from what was said explicitly, but from what was implied. You may underestimate me, but I don't need your approval to know who I am. That silent confidence speaks volumes in a political climate often dominated by bluster and posturing. It was a gentle but powerful reminder that dignity is louder than mockery, if only because it lasts longer in the minds of those who witness it. What caught many off guard was how the moment, so ripe for confrontation, instead became a lesson in maturity. It wasn't just a defense, it was a demonstration of how strength doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it speaks in a quiet tone, with clear facts and a steady gaze. And that, ironically, is far more unsettling to opponents than any shouting match. The power of that calm response also revealed something important about leadership. It's not about who can talk the longest, interrupt the most, or deliver the most stinging insult. It's about who can stand under fire, maintain composure, and respond with integrity. When someone is attacked on a personal level, especially in such a public setting, the temptation is to return fire quickly and fiercely. But when that impulse is rejected and replaced by restraint, something remarkable happens. The audience notices. There was no need for dramatic gestures or grandstanding. The facts, presented plainly and with confidence, spoke for themselves. And in doing so, they did more than just defend. They elevated. In a moment that was supposed to diminish, the response instead redefined the narrative. What was intended to be a put-down became a platform for quiet strength and unmistakable clarity. The atmosphere in the room was already charged with tension the moment the exchange began. What had started as a pointed remark aimed at someone's background quickly took on the shape of a performance. The initial jab drew laughter from a few corners, the kind of reaction that comes more from social momentum than genuine agreement. It's easy to laugh when you think you're siding with the winning team, especially when the target of the joke hasn't yet spoken. but what followed would flip the entire emotional current of the audience on its head. With the calm poise of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, the response didn't just challenge the insult, it dismantled it. Not with theatrics or shouting, but with clarity, presence, and a deliberate tone that brought the room to a near standstill. There was no rush, no visible agitation, just a confident delivery of facts that rewrote the energy in real time. Each word carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was earned, spoken with the authority of someone who didn't need validation from the crowd, yet commanded it effortlessly. It began slowly. A few people in the audience straightened, in their chairs. A murmur of realization passed between some of them. This wasn't going to be the easy, punchline-filled moment they had expected. Then came the audible shifts, the low hum of agreement, the occasional nods from those who had been skeptical moments earlier, and eventually, something unmistakable, a break in the tension as people started to respond, not out of habit, but out of admiration. And then it happened. Applause. Not the polite, scattered kind. This was instinctive, genuine, and unprompted. It erupted as if the crowd had suddenly been snapped into clarity, as if they'd been shown something they hadn't realized they were missing. It wasn't just approval, it was a collective expression of respect. The laughter that had followed, the initial insult now seemed awkward in hindsight, replaced by a deeper kind of appreciation for composure, substance, and sharp intellect, presented without a hint of arrogance. It wasn't simply about what was said, but how it made people feel. The audience, many of whom had likely walked in with preconceived notions, found themselves reevaluating not just the person speaking, but the broader idea of what leadership and intelligence look like. It was a reminder that authenticity can silence cynicism, and that dignity has a far greater impact than derision. There was something almost cinematic about the moment. The shift was that dramatic. The individual who had been on the receiving end of public mockery managed to flip the scene, turning the joke back on itself, not by mocking in return, but by standing firmly and letting the truth, calmly spoken, do the work. The sheer contrast between the original comment and the reply created a kind of intellectual whiplash. What had been meant to entertain now felt out of place, even petty. More than anything, it was the restraint that struck people. In a culture where the loudest voice often wins the headline, it's rare to see someone choose precision over provocation. Yet that's exactly what unfolded, and the audience knew it. Their reaction wasn't just about what had been said. It was about witnessing a rare moment of clarity in a space so often clouded by ego and noise. As the applause grew, it became clear that the balance of control in the room had shifted entirely. The crowd wasn't just reacting to a comeback, they were responding to character. The person who had been underestimated had just redefined the narrative without raising their voice or belittling anyone. That kind of self-possession, that kind of quiet strength, doesn't just win moments. It lingers in people's minds long after the cameras stop rolling. In that single exchange, the dynamic was transformed. The one who had been laughed at was now being applauded, not because they fought fire with fire, but because they didn't need to. They elevated the conversation simply by refusing to lower themselves. The audience didn't just see the moment, they felt it. That's why the reaction was so powerful, so immediate, and so lasting. The room didn't just shift, it realigned. Politeness is often mistaken for weakness, especially in the high-stakes world of politics, where volume and aggression are too frequently equated with strength. In an environment where commanding the room often means outshouting your opponent, a quiet, respectful tone can be misunderstood as submissive or uncertain. But there are moments, rare and revealing, when that assumption is turned on its head. This was one of those moments. What made this exchange so striking wasn't the initial insult. It wasn't even the brazenness of the mockery. It was the response, or rather, how the response unfolded. Without a raised voice, without a hint of retaliation, the one being targeted responded with grace and calm clarity. There was no anger, no sarcasm, just facts, confidence, and a gentle but undeniable strength. That calm wasn't the sign of someone retreating. It was the calm of someone who had nothing to prove. That distinction became impossible to ignore. The earlier jabs, once delivered with such flair and confidence, suddenly looked hollow. The moment someone tried to turn civility into a weakness, they revealed their own misunderstanding of what real strength looks like. The idea that someone who speaks softly or treats their opponents with respect must be intellectually or morally inferior is not just arrogant, it's deeply flawed. Because true strength doesn't need to be loud to be felt. It's often most powerful when it stands its ground without hostility. This interaction put that truth on full display. The entire room witnessed it. The way composure outshined confrontation, the way quiet knowledge dismantled loud assumptions. The power in the room shifted, not because someone forced it to, but because it became clear who actually held it all, along. It was in the way facts were presented, measured, confident, and without the need for showmanship. It was in the refusal to stoop to insult, even when insult had clearly been offered. And it was in the undeniable way the mood in the room changed moment by moment as the true balance of control emerged. This wasn't about who could speak longer or more dramatically. It was about who could speak with purpose. And purpose, when it's authentic, commands attention without demanding it. When someone possesses that kind of presence, they don't need to chase the spotlight. The spotlight naturally turns toward them. And that's exactly what happened. The audience, which had been pulled in by the drama of the initial remark, found itself unexpectedly drawn to something deeper. A steady, unwavering demeanor that didn't flinch under pressure. Moments like this remind people that leadership doesn't have to look like combat. In fact, some of the most compelling leaders are the ones who lead with respect, not rage. They're the ones who listen before they speak, who don't confuse cruelty with cleverness. And when they are confronted with mockery, they respond with such dignity that it becomes clear just how small the insult really was. That's not weakness. That's control. That's discipline. That's strength. The lesson here was as much for the audience as it was for the person delivering the insult. It challenged the assumption that aggression is more effective than intellect, that performance is more valuable than principle. It revealed how easily flash can crumble when faced with quiet substance. And it reminded everyone watching that civility is not a disadvantage. It's a deliberate choice, often made by those confident enough not to hide behind outrage. There's also a certain vulnerability in treating others with respect, especially in a climate that rewards provocation. But that vulnerability is precisely what makes it powerful. It shows that someone is unafraid of scrutiny, unafraid of being underestimated. Because when they respond with calm instead of chaos, and their message still lands with more impact than any insult could deliver, they prove their strength not through domination, but through mastery. What this moment revealed is that true influence doesn't need theatrics. It doesn't rely on who can deliver the best zinger or land the harshest blow. It rests in clarity, consistency, and the ability to remain composed when others lose control. And that kind of strength, not the kind that roars, but the kind that endures, is far more rare, far more impressive, and far more lasting. What unfolded in that moment was more than a verbal exchange. It was a reflection of something deeper, something often missing from today's political and public discourse. It was a rare reminder that character, not clamor, ultimately defines the strength of a person. While one voice tried to dominate through mockery, another rose above through restraint and substance. And the audience, without needing to be told, felt the difference. The contrast between the two speakers could not have been clearer. On one side, there was a display of overconfidence, driven by the assumption that louder means smarter and that ridicule is a valid form of argument. On the other, there was the quiet, controlled confidence of someone who didn't just know who they were, but didn't need to convince anyone of it. That's the kind of self-assurance that doesn't crumble under pressure. It's the kind that becomes more powerful when challenged. Moments like this are powerful, not because of any one line or clever retort, but because they reveal the deeper truth about leadership, integrity, and intelligence. The person who remains calm in the face of insult, who responds with facts instead of fury, changes the entire dynamic of a conversation. They don't just defend themselves, they elevate, the standard. They remind everyone that intellect isn't about performance. It's about understanding, preparation, and the ability to respond with clarity under pressure. In the days and weeks that follow, few will remember the exact words of the insult, but many will remember the way the tone shifted. They'll remember the applause that came not from spectacle, but from sincerity. They'll remember the person who didn't flinch, who didn't fight fire with fire, but instead stood firm and let the truth speak for itself. This moment will stick not because it was loud, but because it was real. It challenged assumptions about what power looks like. It reminded everyone watching that the person who doesn't need to yell often has the most to say. And more than anything, it exposed the vulnerability of arrogance when it runs into quiet strength. That is the kind of moment people replay in their minds, not because it's dramatic, but because it's rare. It shows that in a world full of noise, sometimes the most impactful thing a person can do is remain composed, speak the truth, and let the results speak for themselves. In a single exchange, an attempted insult turned into a defining lesson. That dignity isn't a tactic, it's a strength. And when used well, it doesn't just silence mockery, it earns lasting respect.